Hi, I want to welcome you to the leadership vlog today, and thank you for joining me as I am walking on my journey to becoming the best leader that I can be. And I'm glad to be with you on your journey as well. Today's topic is flying solo, the solitary nature of leadership. I've got a friend who is a pilot. In their pilot training, they would go up in a small plane and they had to log many hours with the instructor in the plane in order to eventually get to the place where they could fly solo. The idea of having an instructor in the plane was specifically so that the training would stick and there would be a training test or a certification process that would end in a pilot's license to allow my friend and all those who are seeking to become pilots, allow them to fly solo. So the idea isn't to always have someone with you. The idea is to actually put the work in so that you can actually be capable of flying solo. There's a really important lesson in that picture. So I want to talk to you about the solitary nature of leadership. Now, I should give you one caveat as we jump into this today, and that is that I'm not reinforcing what I believe is an incorrect view of relationship and leadership, or the partnership between relationship and leadership. Often those who teach leadership and those who we look to as gurus in leadership, they will tell you that you need to keep back boundaries that will allow you to keep a distance between you and those that you lead. And while I strongly support you having healthy boundaries, and I do not believe that we should share everything with everybody, there are different spheres of relationship. Jesus had the inner three, then he had the 12, then he had the 70, and then there was the 120 in the upper room, right? So there are levels of relationship, and I'm totally for that. But what I'm not for is the idea that we as leaders need to wall ourselves in and not allow those that we're leading to actually see us and be authentically on the inside of our relational circle. I think that's detrimental to both the follower and the leader, because leadership is by nature a relationship. And if we're not allowing that pass-through of real, authentic dialogue and exchange at some level, whatever boundary that is appropriate, then real leadership actually isn't happening. So I'm not talking about that, and I don't want to reinforce that. But what I do want to say is that there is a reality in leading that we need to learn how to fly solo. There will be days in our leadership path, there will be times in our organization that we're leading, there will be seasons of our life where it will feel much more like we are all alone than that we have all these people who are actually following us, or the organization's actually in sync with us. There are going to be times, because we are leaders, that we will feel like we're flying solo. Ezekiel 22:30, I think, really speaks to this well. So I sought for a man among them who would make a wall and stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land, that I should not destroy it, but I have found none. I have not found one. I think what the Lord is speaking to here is his heart to have leaders stand in representation of him in the earth. And God is looking, his heart cry is for individuals to find leaders. It says, I sought for a man among you. And we understand it's a man or woman. In the New Testament, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female. Ephesians chapter 2, we get that. So don't get hung up on the male masculine pronoun here. But he said, I sought for a man. This is singular. It's not corporate. I want to tell you that leadership is a singular, solitary call on an individual's life. This isn't something that we pre-qualify because of the company that we're part of, because of the friend group that we have, because of whatever denomination we belong to, or whatever society or trade groups that we're part of, or where we are in the pecking order in any organization. That's not what leadership is about, at least before God. Leadership is an individual calling. So I want to talk to you, just give you 3 things to think about as we talk about the concept of learning to fly solo as leaders, the solitary nature of leadership. The first is this: there are very few what I will call generational leaders, or we might say transformational leaders, or reformational leaders. Do you understand that Martin Luther had to fly solo and he nailed his thesis on the wall? Do you understand that he had to endure a lot of persecution as an individual? He stood alone. He had to be willing to stand alone and fly solo in order to bring about reformation. Likewise, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Reformation that took place in America about racial equality and civil rights. Listen, it is required of a leader to be able to have the fortitude to be able to stand on their own 2 feet and not need the affirmation or confirmation of not only the masses around them, but the people around them, the individuals around them, in order to stay solidly standing in their assignment. You see, there are very few generational leaders. In our day of participation trophies, let me just say to you that while we are doing a good service to try to bring everyone up to equal and fill in those gaps of insecurity and maybe kids that don't feel like they're accepted, and so we give everyone a participation trophy, and I get it. It accomplishes one side of a good thing, but in another way, it actually digs another hole, because there's a requirement for leaders in our generation. And if we don't have an understanding and begin to instill this in even in our kids at an early age, that there is a prize to be had and there's a cost to be paid for leadership. It matters to be good at something and to be great at something and to stand for something. So there are participation trophies, and we've also said it, and I've said it, everyone's a leader, and it's true. Everyone in our sphere, we have leadership influence in whatever sphere we're in. And yet I want to make this clear that there are very few generational leaders. We're not all the same. And I would say to you, in the days that we're living in America and in the world where there's such upheaval, we've gone through the coronavirus and we're still in that response. We've got racial unrest. I would say to you that the cry of my heart is, where are the leaders? I feel like God and his voice is echoing out of Ezekiel into our day. I've sought for a man and I've found none. Where are the generational leaders of our day? You see, sometimes it's required of leaders to fly solo. Nehemiah was called to transform a generation. He was sent back by God to rebuild a city and rebuild a wall. And that is what he did. Ezra was called to bring about a reformation. So while Nehemiah rebuilt a city, Ezra was sent back to rebuild a culture and bring reformation, spiritual reformation to a nation. The second thing I want to say to you about flying solo is that God is looking for individuals. His selection process is not influenced by the size of your friend group on Facebook or how many followers you have on Instagram or Twitter. Regarding the subject of leadership, we each stand alone before God. How are you standing today in his eyes? God's looking for leaders who can stand in the gap, who can rebuild walls. And we'll do a future video on the role of leadership out of Ezekiel chapter 22. But I want to encourage you, God's looking for individuals. I think of Abraham. He was sent out of his country and God told him to leave everyone else behind. Take his wife and leave everyone else behind, right? And so he did that. He went out by himself, and Abraham was a great leader. He's a father of nations, and yet he had to fly solo. I think of Moses, who flew solo as he went into Egypt to deliver Israel out of Egypt. And even though God sent with him a helper, Aaron, he flew solo, and God was teaching him how to fly solo, because there were 40 years that he was going to need to learn how to fly solo, leading Israel as they complained and disagreed with God for 40 years before he would send them into the promised land. I think of Gideon, who was alone in the winepress, and God said, I'm looking for a leader, Gideon, O mighty man of valor. This is an individual thing. And I think of David, who was by himself on the backside of a desert tending sheep while Samuel came to anoint the next king. And all of David's brothers were paraded before Samuel, and there wasn't anyone left. And Samuel said, "Don't you have anyone else? You have another son?" And finally, Jesse said, "Well, yeah, he's out there by himself." And so not only are there very few generational leaders, I'm going to tell you that God's looking for individuals who aren't worried about the size of their Twitter following or their Facebook friends, how many likes they get. And lastly, God is calling courageous individuals. He's not just looking for individuals, he's calling courageous individuals to represent him and his interest in the world. Jesus said, "Not my will, but yours be done." He taught his disciples to pray, "Your kingdom come and your will be done." God's looking for leaders who will stand in the gap to represent him in the earth. It's so important. This is not the American Idol of kingdom popularity contest that we've made it out to be. Who can sell the most books? Oh my gosh, there's a friend of mine, Brandon Gatson. I encourage you to look him up on his website, schoolofreform.com. And I read something that he wrote. He said, "I'm afraid that social media and followings have made leaders out of voices, and we're unable to tell the difference between the two." That's so true. It doesn't matter how many people you have following you. You may have a large voice on Twitter, but the question is, are you leading? Are you willing to stand in the gap? Are you willing to stand up and fly solo? And maybe you're being called to be the next generational leader. There's very few of them. God's looking for individuals. Are you one of those individuals who are willing to stand when it's not popular to represent God and his will on the earth? Well, a leader is not one who's concerned about his tweet as much as his tweet. What's God saying to our culture, to our nation, to our city, to our church, to our family? What's God saying? Who will represent God? And I finish with this, Isaiah chapter 6. A great leader, another biblical leader, standing alone, flying solo in the temple on the Lord's day. Uzziah died, transition in the kingdom. And alone in the temple, God comes. He has a relationship with God. And God says something very interesting. "Who will go for me? Who will I send?" See, this leadership thing isn't about picking a favorite topic or a topic that I'm offended by in our culture and then making a grandstand about it. That's not what godly leadership looks like. Generational leadership, the kind of leaders that God is looking for, are ones who are going to get before his face in his temple when transition is happening, when there's trouble boiling, when things are boiling over. God's looking for leaders who will get on their face and be overcome by his presence and hear him say, "Who will go for me?" So dear ones, I want to encourage you that you may find yourself in a season where you're having to fly solo. Let me congratulate you, because you, my friend, are learning what it means to be a godly leader, one who will represent God and stand in the gap to build walls on God's behalf for the people.